Hi everyone, and welcome to the flipped collaborative recording for our first assignment for EDU80012, Understanding Indigenous Education and Perspectives. My name is Emma Stanton and I'll be your unit coordinator and ELA for this unit. So I'll be with you for the next 8 weeks. What I'm going to do now is to talk about assignment 1 and give you some details and some direction on where to start with it. So you can watch this as many times as you need to, and then we'll be having a live session where you'll be able to ask questions, and we'll also be having a question and answer session where there'll be opportunities as well to ask questions. So I hope you find this useful in doing the first assignment for this unit. I'd like to start by doing an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge and pay respect to the past, present and future traditional custodians and elders of this nation and the continuation of cultural, spiritual and educational practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Ancestors have walked this country and we acknowledge the special and unique place in our nation's historical, cultural and linguistic identity. If you're not quite sure of the difference between an acknowledgement of country and a welcome to country, I really encourage you to do a little bit of research there. As a teacher, you'll be doing an acknowledgement of country as part of your embedding of Indigenous perspectives, so it's really important to understand what it is and when it's used and why it's different to a welcome to country. I'm coming to you from Sydney, so that's the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. If I was in a classroom situation, I would be linking to the Gadigal people because I would be working on that land. This acknowledgement of country is an overall, overview and overarching respectful acknowledgement of country for the traditional custodians in all of Australia, because I know that so many of you are coming from all different parts of Australia. So I've provided the map of Indigenous Australia in the week 1 discussion. I really want you to have a look which country, traditional custodian land you are working and living on, so that you can embed that into your acknowledgement of country. And if you feel nervous about which one to use, remember that as long as it's respectful, you can sort of use other people's ones, do a little bit of joining pieces together. Just be respectful, acknowledging and linked to your land. There's a lot of information on that in the unit, and there's also some specifically that are used in schools. You may have a whole school one you use, so just remember the importance of that in your teaching practices. So for the report, it's due on Friday the 4th of August at 5 p.m, that's week 4. The word limit is 2,000 words, and the writing style is a report style, which I'm going to go through in a minute. The weighting of this assignment is 40% of your overall mark for this unit, and you'll be using weeks 1 to 4 readings. Now I'll be specifically identifying readings throughout this flipped collaborative session that I think is a good place to start in your understanding, but remember all the week 1 to 4 readings are directly connected to this assignment. Please also come to the live session and the Q&A session, and you'll be able to ask questions there, and you'll also really benefit from the questions that other students ask. So it's really valuable to come along, and I'll provide the dates at the end of the session. Also ask questions on your discussion boards, please, because we're here to help. Myself and Kylie, the other ELA, are here to help, so please ask those questions. Okay, so the structure of this assignment is a report structure, which means we'll be including headings. I'm going to give you the specific headings you need to include in a report, and this is what will be expected in this assignment. The first heading you'll have is an executive summary. So this will be no more than 200 words, and I really want you to try and stay in these word limits, because your findings section, which will be 1,200 words, has a lot to cover, so it's really important to keep your introductions and your executive summary within that 200 words so that you have plenty of word space to address the main criteria for this report. So the first heading is an executive summary, which will be no more than 200 words, a written account of the overview of the main points of the report. And this will be something that you'll probably write at the end of the report, where you have a deeper and clearer understanding of what this report was about. So I would leave your executive summary to do at the end, if that makes sense, when you have a really clear understanding of what this report is about, and you can just create one overarching executive summary of what you feel that it's about. The second thing you'll include, the second heading, is an introduction, and it's 200 words. It'll be a little bit like an introduction to an essay, but perhaps a little bit longer, where you'll talk about the importance and significance of this research. You'll be talking about the purpose of the report and outlining the key issues. And you could inform the reader of any assumptions you'd like to address. So it's important here to remember that this is an informative report, so where it's a factual report that's providing information on a specific topic. The next heading will be your findings, and this is going to be divided into 4 key areas, which I'm going to go through in a minute in detail. And the final headings you'll have is conclusion and recommendation. So there'll be 200 words each, and in a minute I'll be going through what to include in each of those sections. Okay. So how to plan for your findings section. So this is the largest section of the report, and it's divided into 4 key areas. Now these 4 points here, I've taken them specifically and directly word for word from the assignment details. So this is what it says in Canvas you need to include in this report. The first point you'll be covering is critically review curriculum frameworks and teaching standards that guide inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, cultures and perspectives in teaching and learning. You're reviewing, which means you are going through the information. So you're going to be looking at key frameworks such as ACARA. You're going to be looking at teaching standards, specifically standards 1.4 and 2.4. And you're going to be talking about any other key documents that will be used as you are guiding the inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, cultures and perspectives in your classroom. So this section's 300 words. So I feel like there's enough to include there when you talk about the cross-curriculum, the cross-curricular priorities and why they weren't embedded in ACARA until 2008 and the significance of this. So there's quite a lot to include here. The second point is demonstrate deep knowledge of local and global education policy surrounding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and current positioning and critical analysis of the impact of policy and on educational systems over time. So there's quite a lot in there, but what we're looking at is we're looking at the current educational position for education for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and also the current position of embedding Indigenous perspectives within classrooms for all students. So we want to look at policies that have impacted this. We want to look at perhaps some historical events that have happened. We want to look at past policies, whether they were successful or whether they failed and why they failed, why this has impacted on the embedding of Indigenous perspectives within classrooms, why has this impacted on the education for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and current positioning. So the current positioning is things like, what are the rates of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students finishing school? Why is it so difficult for them to engage in classrooms? What policies need to be embedded within teaching practices for all students to feel included? To use teaching practices that connect to Indigenous culture so that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students feel more connected to the classroom and they don't feel that they're being educated in with teaching practices that don't link to anything that they can relate to in terms of their history, culture and language and perspectives. So you'll be looking for policies, and I think there's definitely a link there to past events historically. Now, there's a lot of historical events that have led to the current educational context. So it's important to remember your word count and do your readings and work out which ones you feel are most important there. And I think it's especially important to talk about the silent apartheid, which is in the reading rows, and it's a specific period in time in Australia after colonisation and before the referendum, up until the 70s and 80s, where Indigenous perspectives were not embedded into our educational system. And there was a sort of a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding of the importance of connecting to this amazing culture that we have in Australia. So it wasn't until Kevin Rudd's apology that it was actually understood that we need to change the curriculum to suit our Indigenous population, because we want them to succeed at school and feel connected to the education in this country, rather than looking at it from a colonial perspective. So for that section, there's quite a lot to include, and we're going to go through it again in a minute. Section 3, which is demonstrate critical understanding of Aboriginal perspectives on learning and deep knowledge of the implementation of pedagogical approaches that can be utilised to maximise student learning outcomes. Here we start to look at the different Indigenous pedagogies that you can be using, and this is where students start to feel maybe nervous because they don't know what to do. Now, there's quite a range of Indigenous pedagogy to use, which we'll discuss in this unit. You don't need to use all of them all the time. You don't need to use them all every single part of the day, but there's certain parts of them that you can be using throughout your day, and that's why the knowledge of them is so important, to give you confidence in using them throughout the day at different times of the day. And something that's really important that needs to be addressed here is the fact that Indigenous perspectives in education is not just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. It is for non-Indigenous Australians who need to understand what the true history of this country is. All Australians need to understand that Indigenous perspectives, culture, the history of this country is part of who we are, regardless of your background. In Australia, this is something that needs to be embedded in our education system, as it's part of all our lives. Also, when we embed these Indigenous perspectives within the classroom, we are being inclusive, and we're connecting to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, making them feel more engaged and valued, respected and understood. So there's two main reasons for embedding Indigenous perspectives, and this is going to lead to reconciliation, which means we're all going to understand what this country means to all of us and the strong connection we have to our Indigenous histories and cultures in this country. The final section is apply critical thinking to understand ethical approaches to designing, implementing meaningful learning programs into your classrooms. And we want to look at how we're going to measure those outcomes in the classroom. Now, when we talk about ethical approaches here, I feel it's more directed to appropriate approaches. So think about what I just talked about for section 3. We want to critically think about designing the most appropriate, respectful approaches in our classroom, in embedding Indigenous perspectives in a meaningful way that sparks interest and the desire to be educated and finish school in all students. And I feel that the way to measure this student learning is by creating an inclusive classroom, using a range of teaching tools, teaching strategies, Indigenous perspectives throughout the day. What I did here is, because headings are included in the word count, for that section I just described with 4 main points, I want you to use these short headings within your findings section. So in the findings sections, you've got 4 key areas to cover, which is clearly outlined in the assignment details. And I want you to put them in headings. So when we're marking it, myself and Kylie, the other ELA, we can see the specific point you're talking about. So it's not an essay structure in paragraphs. I want 4 clear sections with 4 clear headings. So I've created these 4 headings here to address those 4 points I just talked about. And you can change them slightly if you like, if you feel that something's more appropriate for your report. However, keep it short because these headings are included in the word count. So if you feel you want to change them, that's fine, but just remember the word count and just keep them quite short. So I called the first section Curriculum Frameworks and Teaching Standards, the second one the impact of policy on education, the third one pedagogical approaches, and the fourth one implementing pedagogy through teaching practices. So what I wanted to do here is go those 4 sections that I just spoke about. What I've provided here is just some guidance on where to start, and I've highlighted the part of the marking criteria for each of those sections. And what's quite, I think it's quite advantageous in this assignment is that those 4 key points I just described are the marking criteria. So you need to cover all 4 of them, to pass, but it's very clear that those 4 points are specifically from the marking rubric. So the first part of the marking rubric is that first point I just discussed. If you look at this highlighted section here, it says this is the distinction level, so I want everyone to aim high, and the distinction level says critical review of curriculum frameworks and teaching standards that guide the inclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, cultures and perspectives. So for the first section in the report, you'll be referring to ACARA, the Australian Senior Secondary Curriculum. I'm going to provide all the links in the Padlet. You'll be talking about cross-curriculum priorities and when that was embedded, why it started, what was the historical event that led to that. We're going to be talking about Australians for teaching school leadership standards. So the teaching standards, 1.4 and 2.4 only, they're the ones that specifically link to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives. I also thought you could start with module readings 1.4 and 1.5, which specifically talk about curriculum. And there's another fantastic article, Nakata, in week 4. He's got three readings in week 4, which I highly recommend you read as well to start thinking about curriculum and the importance of curriculum and the curriculum documents you'll be using in your teaching practices. So I hope that gives you a good start on that first section. The second section, again, is the second criteria in the marking rubric. And the rubric distinction level says, detailed analysis of the impacts of educational policy and systems over time. Now, when it says over time, it is asking you to specifically talk about policy over time. So you need to be talking about historical events here. So there's a whole lot of historical events you could talk about. You could start by talking about how colonisation has changed, how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are in Australia and the impacts of the assimilation policies, the impacts of colonisation, and what this has, why we're talking about Indigenous perspectives. What's the connection between these historical events and the current educational context? Start with module readings 1.3, 1.4. So if you go into the modules, you can see those specific readings, and they're the ones I really feel is a good place to start. But as I said earlier, that's just a start. There's a whole lot of fantastic readings in there that you really need to be looking at so that you can do this report. Now you must talk about the silent apartheid, which is the Rose reading in week 2 I was talking about before. This silent apartheid is the reason why there are issues in embedding Indigenous perspectives. Why wasn't Indigenous perspectives embedded 50 years ago in education. There are historical and more contemporary reasons why this silent apartheid, named by Mark Rose in that reading, why it happened. So for example, I went to school in the 60s and 70s. I had no education on Indigenous perspectives. I was part of the silent apartheid. So unfortunately, I really missed out. And our roles as teachers currently is to ensure that this doesn't happen anymore. And all Australians are exposed to Indigenous education and understand the value of it in our Australian culture. You're going to talk about the impacts of the stolen generation. So you look at if you read the Williams-Mosley reading in week 3, he talks about the intergenerational trauma of the stolen generations, which started happening when the assimilation policies happened after colonisation, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were stolen from their families, where the colonisers thought it was best to put the children in, institutions like big dormitories and sort of weed out all the Aboriginality in Australia. And when you start reading about colonisation, you'll see the genocidal nature of colonisation in Australia and the impacts this caused. And the stolen generations refers to all those generations of children who were stolen from 1910 to 1980, were taken from families, where there's generations of culture and history that have been lost over time. And that's why it's very difficult for people of the stolen generations to connect to their culture, because they may have grown up in a non-Indigenous family where they really missed out on that traditional learning that is so special in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, where stories are passed through generations and cultural heritage and learning is passed on through generations. And the stolen generations, the people involved, missed out on all of that as they grew up in non-Indigenous families. So that's really impacted on education in Australia. The current policies being implemented, so you may have heard of closing the gap, the closing of the gap report, which happened. It wasn't until 2019 that the government actually sought advice from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders on where money needs to be allocated to make it effective. So there was 10 years during the silent apartheid where the government did allocate money and finance and assistance to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education, but it was allocated in the wrong places. So it wasn't until 2019, closing the gap report, that a special group has been formed of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders who are helping the government to make the right decision in terms of where that money is going to be used. And this has a real impact on educational outcomes. So there's a lot of detail there in that analysis. I really want to see the analysis of the impacts. Why did the historical events impact on the current educational context? That's the analysis you're looking for there. So for this section, you'll be starting to talk about pedagogy, and we've got both ways learning, 8 ways pedagogy, possum skin pedagogy, if you're in Victoria, and it's a teacher's responsibility to incorporate these into lessons. So for example, in a science lesson, you could be looking at the Indigenous, for a both ways learning perspective. You could be looking at the Indigenous perspective on stars and the sky, or trees and nature, or sustainability, as opposed to a more scientific approach to trees or astronomy. And neither is right or wrong, but you're giving that both ways perspective, an Indigenous perspective and a different perspective. So in this way, you're utilising that pedagogy, and you can use that in English, science, and in language. There's 8 ways pedagogy, which perhaps many of you have heard of. One of the interesting things is with 8 ways pedagogy, you only have to use parts of it. So it's not saying to use all of those 8 ways all day, every day. It's saying take parts of that align to your personal teaching strategies and practices to incorporate that Indigenous perspective. And it's interesting to know that shared learning is one of the 8 ways pedagogy. So that collaborative learning style is probably something you've all seen in classrooms or done in your own classroom. For example, a yarning circle is something you could use to align with 8 ways pedagogy. So it's like a shared learning experience where we can where students learn to listen, they learn to take turns, they learn to be respectful of each other's opinions. They can learn to make decisions together as a class. So if you're already doing that sort of collaborative learning, you are using an 8 ways pedagogy for the shared learning. If you're using yarning circles, it's important to identify that to the students. So don't just do it. Explain to the students why you're sitting in that yarning circle, why you're taking turns to listen, how it links to 8 ways pedagogy. And you can embed that throughout many lessons throughout the day. And if you're feeling nervous about how to embed these Indigenous perspectives, that's a really good way to start, because it's probably something that you're really comfortable with already. So I'm providing links to these pedagogies in the Padlet, so make sure you really feel confident of what they are. And remember, you don't have to use all aspects of them at all times. Just use them throughout the day where appropriate, in line with your own teaching practices. Now, possum skin pedagogy is only to be used in Victoria because it aligns with the custodians of the land there. It's the teacher's responsibility to connect to the Aboriginal ways of learning, to engage Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students and teach non-Indigenous students about these different perspectives on learning. So it's really important to discuss that in this Part 3 section. And remember that best practice in teaching will always use a strength-based approach. So we're always looking for a way to focus on students' strengths and positive skills, and let's look at what they can offer rather than what they can't do. So that's something that all teachers should be doing at all times for all students anyway. And that strength-based approach links very closely to these Aboriginal ways of learning and Indigenous perspectives. Also for Part 3, I really want you to focus on this attribute model in education for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. So Dr. Chris Sara, there's a reading in week 2, and he's developed the Stronger Smarter Institute, where he works closely with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students to achieve educational outcomes and to increase the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students completing school and feeling proud of their Aboriginality, feeling proud of who they are, going into classrooms with that real attribute model of what they can offer, rather than going in with a deficit feeling, a feeling of I can't do it anyway. So he really works closely. His reading's amazing, his research is fantastic, his work is unbelievable. So read that first as you develop your ideas for Part 3. The rubric here says a deep knowledge of the authentic application of pedagogical approaches and the implication of student learning outcomes. So you could talk about the pedagogies we talked about on the previous slide. You can definitely talk about Dr. Chris Sara and the attribute model, and you can also talk about learning outcomes. So by using these pedagogical approaches and the attribute model, what do you think the outcomes will be for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students? Why do you think they could potentially be more positive outcomes? What are the outcomes for non-Indigenous students? So there's a link there to a Outcomes and Partnerships government website, which I'll put it in the Padlet as well, because you probably can't access it here. So please make sure to do that reading for Part 3. The final section, the rubric in the distinction level says, understanding of approaches to designing and implementing meaningful learning programs that are representative of Aboriginal knowledge, perspectives with the authentic measurement of student learning. So here we would be talking about different approaches we would be using to connect to Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. And I want you really to understand the importance of this education for all students. So we're not learning Indigenous perspectives just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. More importantly, students who have no knowledge of Indigenous culture, who need to know, who want to know about the history of their country, the culture of this country, the arts, the music, the language of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. And in this way, we're connecting non-Indigenous Australians to a strong part of something in Australia. When we're measuring this sort of outcome, I would think that we're looking at inclusive classrooms where all students are engaged and included, and we want to look at retention, finishing school, attending class, relationships amongst the class, a relationship amongst classmates. That's a good outcome for whether your learning, your teaching and learning has been successful. So see in this section if you can think of any other ways that you can measure the students' learning in relation to embedding Indigenous perspectives. Now, we don't want to talk about standardised teaching. We want to talk about more open-ended, two-ways learning. And on that, I really encourage you all to watch In My Blood It Runs on Netflix, which really demonstrates that standardised teaching and learning practice that can be so ineffectual and so disadvantageous for many students who haven't had an education that is directed in that way. So I'll provide the link to that in the Padlet. So we've talked about critical thinking a lot in the marking rubric and in the assignment. And when we're talking about critical thinking, we really want to be looking at all those words like analyze, interpret, evaluate, and make a judgment about what you read. So you need to get all your evidence together so that you can make a judgment on this report and a judgment of your understanding of what this report is about, so that you can go back to your executive summary and really understand the overarching idea of this report. So some things you can think about is, when we talk about inclusivity in the classroom and best practice, we are talking about a both ways approach. We are talking about teaching all students. So all students with different learning needs and different learning styles is best practice anyway. So a both ways approach is really encompassing all students regardless of where they're from. We also, reconciliation is so important, and this is why it's important to be always considering that this is for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, so we can change the landscape of Australia and work toward bias, work against bias and discrimination, and work as a nation together with Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians together. Why knowledge of the true history of Australia is so important in that reconciliation. I know for myself, I learned about Captain Cook at school and doing projects on Captain Cook. There was no mention of anything to do with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So, like, I grew up, I didn't know, it wasn't until I was an adult and I started, becoming an academic that I understood what I had missed out on. Why all students need the knowledge of Indigenous Australian history, cultures and languages. Apart from the fact that it's amazing and valuable and part of who we are, this is part of our country and our history. This is the true history of what happened from the Indigenous perspective, and this is the truth of how, after colonisation, Australia was formed. So we're a young country, and the history of this country is so important that we all know. And I've just talked about why it's so important for non-Indigenous students. To change Australia over the next number of years, we need to start educating children, young children, secondary years children, so that they all understand the importance of this history of our country as we move forwards. Okay, so your conclusion and recommendations. Your conclusion will be 200 words, and it will be exactly like a conclusion of an essay. But when you do your recommendations, you will be saying something like, you could make 2 or 4 recommendations. You could make 2 for standard 1.4 and 2 for 2.4. You could really link it to what you've learned in your report in terms of strategies for teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, and then understand and respect how important this is between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. So there's 2 key ideas for this report that you will be addressing in your recommendations. These standards here in the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers, 1.4 and 2.4 will be your recommendations. And as I said, you can either make it to 100 words each, or you could do 4 shorter recommendations, 100 words each. So you can do, what you could be doing is you can do whole school approaches for your recommendations, or you can do in-class recommendations for you specifically in the classroom. So there's 2 ways to do it, and it really is up to you. You can add supporting literature there. You can link back to the standards. You may want to link to ACARA or one of the readings I've mentioned in the Flip Collaborative so far. And we'll be going through this again in the live session. The final criteria of this assignment is academic writing, where you'll be looking at expression, referencing, accuracy, logic and flow, and that's really important. Remember to proofread your work, and please remember this is only worth 10 marks, but it's 10 marks. So it can make the difference from a pass to a credit, or a credit to a distinction, or even a distinction to a high distinction. So these 10 marks are achievable by all of you. Refer to your referencing guides, ask for help on the discussion boards. I'm quite an expert on referencing, so I can answer any questions. I'll help you in any way I can. If you just want help in referencing something, just let me know. So proofread your work, make sure it flows well, and follow these report guidelines. These are the dates for the live session on the 23rd of August and the Q&A session on the 6th of September. So I'll be sending out reminders before then, so please come along to those to ask questions. Where do I research? So you use the weekly readings 1 to 4, and please use wider research if you find relevant literature to use. There's one website I don't want you to use, it's Creative Spirits. That will come a lot as you research, so it's called Creative Spirits. There's been a bit of controversy on that website because it's written by a non-Indigenous author, and the accuracy has been sort of debated, and the motives for doing that research also is questionable. So don't use Creative Spirits, but if you want to research wider, that'd be fantastic. Make sure it's current. Make sure it's academic, so ending with an edu or a .org.au, something that's really relevant, academic. Try to steer away from using any other students' papers in your research, which you may come across other people's essays or reports. But if you do just use the week's 1 to 4 readings, then that's fantastic. There's a lot in there. It's all fantastic reading. Your references list must follow APA 7th edition referencing and alphabetical order on a separate page. Now, a bit of a tip here, some of you may not know, is that if you go into the modules section in Canvas, scroll right down the bottom of the page, the references list for the whole unit is there, which means if you're not quite sure how to set it out, you can basically just cut and paste that into your assignment for the readings that you've used. And it will also give you guidance on how to set out the references list, because I know it can be quite tricky to add in the dates and it can be tricky sometimes, but that's always there. So I think it's a really good tip to just check if you're on the right track with your references list. Terminology in this assignment is vitally important and respectful, and I really feel strongly that you use the correct terminology in your assignments and discussion boards and in your teaching roles. Now, I've provided 3 different terminology guides in discussion 1.9, so could you please look at them, and I want you to be using the correct language. Just for your professional and personal development, it's vitally important as role models for students, and it's also the right thing to do. I really feel strongly about this. Capital letters for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, use Indigenous sparingly. Have a look at those terminology guides. There's 3 there, and it really tells you the words that are completely inappropriate, the words you can use, when you can use them. So please look at that before you start writing your assignments. And also, I do also recognise that this is new information for a lot of you, so if you do make a mistake, that's okay as well. It's all learning, so we're not going to be taking marks off or getting really cross at you about this, but it's really important to know the correct terminology. You know, in the classroom, you need to be using the correct language for your students. And so please go through those for me. Thanks, guys. Here's some supporting literature, which I've taken this straight from the assignment details. You'll have a direct link in the assignment details to academic writing, so there's some examples of reports in there. There's your style guide and some help with referencing. So that's all in the assignment details in Canvas. So please use them. It's really important for that final criteria in the assignment. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found this useful. Remember, you've still got the live session, and ask as many questions as you like. I know this can be an encompassing unit. There's a lot to take in, and I feel very passionate about it, and I really want to help you have a successful outcome and learn a lot in this unit. Thanks, everybody.